to deal with all this than applying laws strictly, respecting human dignity, applying all kind of laws, organizing things. It means that people have to be accommodated, taking into account, taking into charge. You have to make so they can have the instruction of the asylum application integrated or go back to the country. And in this context, you don't have to hide anything. The reality is the reality. And I do believe that one of the problems we are facing in the public opinions in Europe and maybe somewhere else is that the people know that we don't really apply collectively, all the aspects of the law. We don't completely, I don't say OFPRA try to respect completely its obligations, but on a global ground we have to do more in Europe and everywhere to apply really asylum laws. And we have to do much to apply the limits of this. For example, the fact that someone who is not recognized as refugees and doesn't have any other kind of reasons to stay has to go back to his country.
Hey UC3P listeners, I'm Thomas.
And I'm Nick.
In the United States, public faith in the military remains sky high, while trust in other government institutions sinks to an all-time low.
At the same time, fewer than 1% of Americans will ever serve in the armed forces, and the cultural divide between active duty troops and the civilian population continues to widen.
UC3P presents a new series, Thank You for Your Service, where we take a deep dive into the complex world of civil-military affairs.
We'll address the politicization of the military, defense policy in the news, and the importance of staying informed in a democracy.
Join us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts as we explore how our professional military institution relates to the society it serves.
You've been talking about asylum laws a lot, and I feel there's a need to focus on these to better understand what they are and how they are applied. So I'm aware that once a person enters France, he or she is supposed to apply for asylum within 90 days of entry. And then OFPRA looks at the application and decides whether it's to be accepted or rejected. So what are some of the criteria based on which these asylum laws are applied? I'm assuming one of the criteria is the genuineness of claims of persecution by the applicant, and there could be certain others. Could you talk about these?
You're absolutely right. The criteria are the criteria of the international and European law. You know that our Bible is the Geneva Convention, which gives the criteria of to be a refugee. It means that OFPRA receives a file in which each man, woman explains the reason why he cannot go back to the country. His fears, her fears to go back to the country. And then each one has an interview with OFPRA, close to Paris, or we send people all around France sometimes to make those interviews. And with this, we are going to check the credibility of what the persons tell us about his fears to go back to the country. And if it's according to the criteria of the Geneva Convention, which are mainly political commitment, ethnical belonging, religious beliefs, and all other kind of things which make that you belong to a social group in the sense of the Geneva Convention. It means that you have there are elements that make that you belong to a social group, and we match that there is a very violent hostility of the society of the country of origin towards this group. Example, homosexual or lesbians in some countries. If those criteria are established, if what the person say is credible to our mind, we check with the situation we know in the country. For example, if someone says, I belong to an ethnic in a country, and I'm persecuted for that, we are going to make sure that this does exist in this country. And we have specialist researchers in OFPRA that work on that. Those are the criteria of the Geneva Convention to be refugee. If it doesn't work, if I can say so, then we are going to check if the person is not under the protection of European law with subsidiary protection, which is another protection for asylum for two kinds of this situation. First, people who don't have a personal commitment, which it would be under the Geneva Convention, but have been going away from war zones. For example, some regions of Afghanistan, now, or some part of Syria? Or is there a fear for torture or death penalty? And then you can be protected under the subsidiary protection. If you are not under the criteria of the Geneva Convention and nor subsidiary protection, then your demand is rejected, but you have an appeal to a court.
So is this subsidiary protection ranked lower than asylum?
No, it's part of asylum. In France, to be very precise, you have 3 kinds of asylum that OFPRA recognize. First, constitutional asylum, which is something very special that we recognize for people who are freedom fighters. I give you one example. There is a man now, a Syrian man, who arrived in France, who've been during 18 years in the Syrian jails from the Al-Assad father and Al-Assad son. He came in France. We have been very proud to recognize him as constitutional asylum. Second, Geneva Convention. Third, subsidiary protection. It's all asylum. The difference is that subsidiary protection gives you a residency which is not permanent. Constitutional asylum and refugees, 10 years residency, which can be renewed. If it's subsidiary protection, it's 4 years renewed. But the reality is that it's the same kind of protection.
Right. So we've been talking about the different kinds of protection available and the criteria for these. I'm also curious to know about the time taken to decide on a certain application. So usually it's between 6 to 12 months as per the available statistics, but OFPRA has claimed that it is trying to bring this down to 2 months, which sounds like a very ambitious outcome. So what are some of the steps being taken by OFPRA to achieve this?
It's a very important goal to reduce the delays. When I arrived in OFPRA 6 years ago, the average delay in OFPRA was 9 months. Only OFPRA, and OFPRA is not the only part. First, you have to go to Préfecture. Préfecture are home office desks in the regions that you have, where you have to register. Then you send your file to OFPRA. You have the interview, and if you are rejected, you go to the court. Something like 3 years ago, this global process was more than 2 years. Now it's average 1 year, and in this, OFPRA was 8 months, it's now 3 months. So we've been reducing very much those delays. We've been reforming very much OFPRA during those 6 years, a complete reform of OFPRA, and we are going on. At the moment that we are talking now, we are have a new process to reduce still a little more those delays so that the people have their interviews faster. So we are still working on that so that we can reduce the delay, but I have to underline something. We have to reduce, and we are going to go on reducing those delays, because you understand that for the asylum seekers, the first right is to have a fair decision. The second right is to have a quick decision, because it's so hard they have been suffering so much that make them wait so long is something we cannot afford. But having said that, I must underline that there is another principle which is very important in our mind. You must have a length of the instruction which must be adapted to the personal situation of the asylum seeker. I give you 1 or 2 examples. When we are talking about a woman who have been suffering persecutions as women, you can imagine that she can need time to say that in the interviews. So we take time. Other example. Someone who is persecuted in his country because of his sexual orientation. You can need time. Third example. You have women. I think, for example, of young women coming from Nigeria who are suffering human trafficking, sexual exploitation. Sometimes they need time to tell us, I am a victim and I have to be protected. So we have to adapt the length of the procedure.
You know, it's very heartening to hear that OFPRA is protecting people persecuted on the basis of their gender, sexuality, and other things. And you have on several occasions highlighted the importance of the principle of non-refoulement. Despite this, however, I feel there are certain areas where France could do more to help refugees. And I'd like to mention a few of these. Firstly, if you look at the rate at which France accepts asylum applications, it's only about 30 to 35%, which is considerably lower than the overall European Union average. Secondly, the European Court of Human Rights has pulled up France on different occasions for deporting asylum seekers even while their applications were being heard in French courts. And thirdly, the new French immigration law is much harsher than the previous one and makes deporting refugees easier. Do you think these are fair criticisms of France? And if so, what is the country doing to better meet its commitment to refugees?
Yeah, we have to do much more, much better. Not only in France, in Europe as a whole, and all over the world. And I do believe that, yes, we still have to do more. And OFPRA has been reforming itself very much. And we try to do more. If I come to the protection rate, I must tell you that it's true that if you take the average rate of protection in Europe and in France as a whole, in France it's not 30, it's 40, if you take into account the appeal. The European average is a little higher. The difference was much higher 2, 3 or 4 weeks years ago. We've been reducing that. For example, if you take OFPRA, 6 years ago our protection rate was 9%. It's now 30%. Above all, we've changed something which is very key. Till 5 years ago in France, when you were protected, you were more protected by the court than by OFPRA, which was something completely abnormal, not normal. And I said it publicly, and I said it to my teams. And we've been very much on that, not because we are nice people, but thanks to the elements of the law, of the right. And now we've changed it completely. Now, when you are protected, 4 people protected in France as refugees, 3 by OFPRA, 1 by the court. So, to show you that we've been very much working on that. If I come back to the comparison with Europe, the reality is that this average is a nonsense. I try to explain why. Because it depends too much on the national composition of the demand in each country. I take you, for example. In Germany, you have many more Syrians than in France, seeking for asylum. Syrians, 95% protection rate in Germany and in France. But many more seeking for asylum in Germany than in France. In Germany, you have less people from Albania, 4% protection. From Haiti, which is a terrible situation, but not for asylum, 2% protection. So you have this incidence of the competition by nationality on the protection rate. If you take this into account, you will see that nowadays France is protecting as the average of main European countries and sometimes more. And especially for one reason I would like to underline with you. OFPRA, such as its Irish colleagues, Swedish colleagues, Belgian colleagues, some more, has a specificity, a legal one. We are independent. The French law says OFPRA cannot receive any kind of instruction. We just apply asylum. And this makes that we have sometimes higher level of protection than in other countries. But, coming back to your point, I do say that we have to do more. First, to make that people can apply for asylum when they want to. This is a European problem and a French one. Second, we have to make that all asylum seekers have to be accommodated, which is not already the case despite the fact that we accommodate more people than in the past. We have to integrate more people who are refugees. So yes, we have to do more. We've been doing rather much. But in my mind, the question is the first one you were raising. How can we do that? And we have to do it in the social context we are facing France in Europe and in the United States and some other countries.
Mr. Brice, it's a pleasure talking to you, but unfortunately all good things have to come to an end, and since we're running out of time, this interview should end as well. Thank you so much for talking to us. You do genuinely come across as somebody who's trying his best to make the world a better place. Thank you again.
That's very kind. Thank you very much to you.
Hi podcasters, thanks for listening to this episode. Big ups to Prabhat Singh for interviewing and editing, Sushmita Singha for engineering, and Lauren Lee for producing. Special thanks to the Pearson Institute for bringing Pascal Brice all the way to Chicago